All right, thank you, everyone. I think we're all back at our seats now and ready to do a recap of our breakout sessions. So I think maybe we can start with breakout room A.
Who was A?
Yeah.
I think
That was Brian.
yeah,
That was
Brian,
Brian.
Jim,
and
Okay.
I.
yeah.
Sure. Yes, happy to start. So we covered a lot of ground, and in fact, we probably covered questions that aren't, or answers to questions that we don't have, and in addition to the questions that we do have. But maybe starting, and we were the second set of questions, so the questions around communication around fraud. And so maybe on question one, relative to the effective two-way communication with audit committees, I would say, there were some perspectives that maybe some of that has become or can become boilerplate, and there could be focus on how to keep that fresh and making sure that the dialogue and the underlying content and the thinking around risk assessment continues to be refreshed and current and is updated as you think about the ongoing responsibilities throughout the audit. There were some questions, or we had some discussion around the pressure of relationships and the obvious need to make sure that you use the executive session appropriately, because obviously management is in the room for part of audit committee discussions. And so depending on the nature of what you might be talking about, there's obviously probably good alignment at the top when you're talking about the potential for fraud within an organization, more deeply within the organization. But if you're talking about fraud risks that go all the way up to the top of the organization, making sure that you're making good use of the executive session for discussions around those types of risks. Let's see, prioritization is important relative to thinking about the varying risks, and making sure you're asking questions like, if a fraud were going to be committed at this company, how would it occur, so that you're actually engaging deeply in a discussion about how it actually may occur, and getting more than a boilerplate response relative to assumptions that maybe fraud couldn't or wouldn't or is unlikely to occur. So those were some of the points around the two-way communication. As it relates to information in the auditor's report, we had a lot of discussion around what that would be. Would it be around the risks and the auditor's response? Would it be just the risks? Would it include the auditor's response? Would it be about suspected or actual fraud that's been identified? And it became clear through the discussion that there are mixed views on the usefulness and questions by, I think, many people about whether that would be useful, and if so, how it would be useful. Notwithstanding, I think there was more interest in exploring the potential usefulness around risk assessment and perhaps response, where it seemed like there could be some value in some degree of disclosure, at least that's worth disclosing. It was made clear that there are idiosyncratic needs of investors, and therefore you're not likely to get consensus on the views on incremental disclosure in that space. Importantly, management first, relative to their own disclosures and thinking about what management's already doing and disclosing relative to fraud risk considerations, was something we spent a good amount of talking about, and frankly, I think a lot of similar views on that point, that should be a starting point. Not that that's the ending point for auditors, of course, as well. We talked about pros and cons and unintended consequences, and certainly you could come up with long lists of those. Certainly, pros could be that there's deeper understanding of what auditors do. There's deeper discussion with management and audit committees around the potential risks. We also talked about there being potential cons, that it could actually undermine determinations of certain matters as fraud risks if there's need for disclosure, which would be unintended and unfortunate, and certainly the attendant costs that would come with it and the like. But certainly there's a long list of pros and cons that would need to be weighed. Seems like the views were that it's pretty highly speculative relative to, first of all, understanding how to get the most value out of it, and then what the value would actually be, and so that there's a lot of need for probably further development of the idea relative to disclosure in this space, and seeking feedback so that you are maximizing the value and coming up with something that would be most useful and helpful. So maybe I'll just pause there. Jim, please go ahead and add.
Yeah, perhaps there was you mentioned this already, but just to add a bit to it, Brian, the discussion of materiality and fraud came up. And the specific example given was, if you have a very low level, low dollar number of a fraud that occurs very low in the organization, and otherwise for it to be a very highly controlled at the top, good tone at the top organization, you may look at that differently than if that relatively low dollar value fraud occurred high up in the organization, suggesting it could lead elsewhere. So there's a qualitative and a quantitative consideration of fraud. There was one example given where engagement letters even indicate that if we discover a fraud that we deem to be immaterial, we're not going to tell you, the audit committee, about that necessarily. And so there's got to be more work done and consideration given to the control aspects of fraud, because in the control aspects, there wouldn't be a materiality consideration. And then where and how the immaterial or otherwise known to be immaterial fraud may occur. And I think that's important. And back to the comment of, just to, again, Brian, to augment what you said, the discussion between the auditors and the audit committee, it's the type of question you ask, how you ask it, and when you ask it. And just like the consideration of fraud begins with the planning process and goes throughout the entire engagement, those questions and discussions between the auditors and the audit committee should happen at various stages throughout the engagement, not necessarily just at the end. By the way, Mr. Audit Chair, Miss Audit Chair, you don't have any knowledge of any fraud, do you? It's a much more open-ended question that leads to the conversation about fraud. Thanks, Brian.
Yep. And then maybe on the first set of questions, and I'm not going to go through in any level of detail because that's for the other groups, but there were a few things that came out that are kind of more generic or general that are probably worth mentioning. I will comment though just on the first question. We spent a good amount of time, and I think there was pretty much, I would think, consensus I would be able to say. The clarifying by just simply talking about the role of the auditor as a gatekeeper relative to fraud would probably be ambiguous. It could actually undermine the existing precision that's in today's standards relative to responsibilities, and probably was not going to be the most helpful way to improve performance here or achieve the objectives that one might be trying to achieve relative to better likelihood of detection of fraud. We spent a good amount of time talking about training of more or less tenured folks within firms and having them see and feel and understand what it's like to identify a fraud. We talked about the importance of less tenured folks, in particular, understanding the public purpose of auditing, and thinking about that in a internalizing that in a way that helps them think about their responsibilities. We also talked about promoting the PCAOB and others' understanding of the positive things that one sees in this space. If you kind of look at inspection results, there may not be a lot in many respects relative to performance issues in this space, which means there's plenty of good examples of what auditors are doing in this space as well, and promoting some of that and suggesting that others do some of those same types of things, whether that be through best practices or just even describing the performance that one sees from an inspection perspective and otherwise could be useful. And then just briefly, I know that Doug raised the title in the standard and consider being the word, and one consideration or question at least is, could the board even overnight change that title to addressing the risks of, because it would be consistent with actually what's in the standard. It actually wouldn't change any underlying performance. That's a question for a lawyer as to whether you can just change the title or not. But I don't think that word "consider" in the title is intended. It has no effect on the performance and the requirements in the standard, which certainly go well beyond consider. Auditors today, I don't think, look at that title and even think about it in that way. But if that's causing a perception issue, that's something presumably that could just be changed, maybe even just literally overnight, but certainly through a pretty easy amendment that I can't imagine anyone would object to. So I don't know if you want to add anything.
And not specifically on the points of standard setting, but on the larger point of the profession. It was viewed that anything that can be done generally to reinforce the public purpose of auditing, and even the noble purpose of auditing and the nobility of auditing, will be helpful to the general considerations of these matters before you even get to the next level of setting standards. And I think there was general universal agreement on that in our discussion group. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Jim. I think, Preeti, that's what we have.
Okay, great. What's next? Should I go next?
I thought you said Dame David would go
That's
next.
fine.
I can go. All right. So David and I were in a great group, and it was the conversation was widely scoped. So I'll do my best to try to summarize some of the things we heard. I think there was some discussion around know the business, and we think that is kind of an important theme. And there is, there's an acknowledgement, hey, there's a mismatch in information held between management and the auditor, and so that is an issue, right? How can you go and provide skepticism and and kind of ask the tough questions if you have that asymmetric information, and so there is perhaps opportunity to improve through processes, auditors' ability to know the business. Some of it came back to this investor auditor profession expectation gap. We had a lot of conversation about, well, what do we mean by fraud? What is the fraud we're talking about? Do we just focus in on scoping it for public company financial fraud and financial statements, or is it a wider definition? And views were kind of across the board there. So that might be an opportunity for clarity for the PCAOB to just kind of put it out very clearly in terms of what expectations are, what we mean by these things, perhaps what we mean by materiality in these contexts. The word gatekeeper, that took us on a long discussion. I think there was, from hearing, I didn't hear anybody who's like, we love this word and this is the word to use. There was a lot of comments made that the term has some baggage that goes along with it from a lot of different contexts. So, maybe there's a better opportunity to really try to articulate what that role the auditor is playing, but gatekeeper might not be the ideal term. We got into a lot of conversation about, you have a problem in a financial statement. Is it fraud? Is it an error? And there's probably kind of a gray area in the middle there. The standards more and more are asking management teams to and bring judgment into the process, or whether disclosure does get into a filing or doesn't get into a filing. Some of these come down to judgment and how people define things like materiality and other things like that. So that was another area where maybe there's more opportunity for specificity. We had a lot of this conversation about, well, here's a problem. Is that intentional or unintentional? And then if it's not formally in the fraud box, are we talking about here? I think insert an investor view, but, we do care about just getting broadly financial statements that are decision useful, but not to go off too far there. One comment, or a few folks brought up the comment that in traditional fraud procedures, traditionally there's been a lot of historical kind of zeroing in on revenue recognition, and while it still might be a very important area that does kind of often present issues for fraud. There were some who brought up the topic, well, maybe it's kind of leading the witness, and people are becoming too fixated on looking at revenue recognition, and they're kind of anchored to that area and not necessarily kind of taking a holistic view. And because for every business, maybe it's a little bit different. Maybe there's other areas that are important, and if there's an overemphasis on that particular area. A lot of good, healthy discussion about whistleblowers. Someone said, well, maybe there's more opportunity for specific procedures around whistleblowers. What is a best practice for setting up a whistleblower program? Might you have internal control problems if it's not kind of structured up the right way? Another comment was brought up about data from inspection reports. We said, well, if you have all these years of inspections, maybe there's an opportunity to bring a lot of that data to a group like this, so we can actually analyze it and maybe see case studies and things along those lines, because that might give us more data to actually leverage and kind of make informed decisions about this. And lastly, just say complexity and judgment are big parts of accounting these days, and that makes kind of detecting and auditing fraud a harder issue. So, David, I don't know if you
That's
other
pretty
things
well
to-
said.
to the
I just
best.
would maybe underscore that, I think we heard where the board can pull in more external data to help them evaluate this, given it is on the midterm agenda. One person suggested even looking at some SEC enforcement cases. They have very clear definitions of what fraud is and what fraud is not. That would be super helpful, we think, to bring into the dialogue as you continue to just gather information.
Thank you. Preeti?
Okay, sounds like we had very different discussions in each room, which is fantastic. Our room discussed or spent a good bit of time talking about the definition of fraud and whether it should be revised. So we talked about whether it should be expanded to include corruption and bribery or even third-party fraud when there is a risk of material misstatement. We also talked about the fact that there could be some confusion about the current definition, which requires, that there's a legal concept and auditors do not make a legal determination, and sometimes that leads to a performance misinterpretation. There are items outside of misstatements and asset misappropriation. For example, data issues, data that's been breached, and how that could lead to a potential fraud-related issue, and how an auditor should address that. So those were some of the things we talked about in terms of the definition. We talked about the fact that fraud schemes have gotten much more sophisticated. There was an example about even made-up avatars, having fake discussions and so forth. And so how do you stay on top of these current trends that are constantly evolving? And this is where potentially a fraud center could be super helpful in pulling together kind of the latest and greatest schemes and helping train both the company side as well as the auditor side to stay on top of these issues. We talked about some red flags and procedures that could include testing whistleblower programs as well as the code of ethics for effectiveness. For example, somebody said there was a study that if several hotlines had been called and only a fraction of them you could actually report a complaint, suggests that even if they're set up, that they may not be actually effective. So evaluating the effectiveness of them could be helpful. And in addition, looking at the complaints, but making sure that that's not complaints coming through the sieve of management, but rather maybe some direct approach, because then you may not be getting at the real crux of the problem, as it often happens at the top of management level. So testing to make sure you can file a complaint anonymously and that the whistleblower program is complete, as well as following best practices. We also talked about another procedure as an example, journal entry testing, where you could use various screening and filtering mechanisms to kind of target risk-based journal entries rather than just randomly picking, and that these kinds of approaches are maybe being used across audit firms, and they may vary by industry, but collecting these could be helpful to as part of like a fraud center activity, or even just best practices in auditing, and could be used to address fraud as well. In terms of communication, we talked about the fact that it could be problematic to simply have expanded communication that could become a regurgitation of the standards and very boilerplate. So looking for ways to avoid that could include discussion about fraud risks, perhaps procedures performed, but other things we talked about didn't necessarily conclude on, but mentioned. Could there be expanded discussion about findings that auditors have made? For example, if you found ICFR issues, even if they've been remediated by the year end, that could be something that investors would want to know as showing the value of the audit. Or perhaps other communications that the auditor has with the audit committee, such as audit adjustments or other items. There could be components of that communication that could be useful to make public to investors to show the value of the audit and what was actually done. And I think, and then one more issue was the fact that a lot of times one of the issues in reporting the fraud is that there's a budget constraint. And so that might lead people who are on the team to feel like they don't have the time to look at what they need to do. And one way to, I mean, this is a culture issue, and one way to perhaps deal with that is to make sure there's internal surveys sent out to the employees to ask about, do they feel comfortable reporting? Do they feel like there's mechanisms? Do they feel too much pressure with timing? And also to maybe celebrate when somebody has found something and has withstood management pressure, that showing internally in the organization within the audit firm that that was valued, and making that public could be helpful in shifting the culture. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Those are very very in-depth overviews. I was wondering if there any SEIAG members had any other points they wanted to elaborate on from the breakout discussions, or any reactions. Well, thank you to the subcommittee members for leading the breakout discussions and the recaps. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for all the input. We certainly have a lot to take back and think about. That was a great discussion. Transitioning, this brings us to our last session of the day. We want to get your input on the auditor's consideration of the internal audit function. Our project team members, Nick Grillo and Andrew Cleve, plan on walking us through the discussion questions.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Cleve. I'm an Assistant Chief Auditor in OCA. As Barb mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about AS 2605, which was adopted as an interim standard in 2003 upon when the PCAOB was established. It is based on a standard issued by the AICPA more than 30 years ago. Many changes have occurred in the environment since the standard was originally issued and subsequently adopted by the board, including, for example, the enactment of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the requirements for management to make certain statements about internal control over financial reporting, as well as adoption of PCAOB standards addressing risk assessment and integrated audits. So we're interested in your views and experiences and observations relating to the auditor's requirements for consideration of the work of internal auditors. We're also interested in any academic research papers, external reports, or other information that provides additional perspectives on this topic, including potential economic impacts, and that should be taken into consideration. The materials you were provided include relevant background information, key provisions of AS 2605, and the discussion questions for the session. Briefly, those slides provided an overview of the requirements in AS 2605 and securities laws, including certain provisions relating to assessing competence and objectivity of internal audit personnel, using the work of internal audit for the entity's own purposes, such as considering how that work will affect the audit, evaluating the extent of that effect, and evaluating the quality and effectiveness of that work, and lastly, obtaining direct assistance from internal audit, including planning and supervising that work. So to facilitate the discussion, included on slides 11 and 12, on the briefing slides are the questions that we would like your thoughts on. Perhaps it's easiest to break these up into the first four and the last two. If we can go to, can I? Yeah. Go, okay. Sorry, let me just jump ahead. Just the first four questions. The first one is, what factors do auditors consider when determining whether to use the work of internal audit? How are auditors using internal audit to alter the nature, timing, and extent of auditors' work? Two is, are there ways to better align the standard with the risk assessment standards? And three, how and to what extent are auditors obtaining direct assistance from internal auditors? And four is, are there unique considerations or other matters with respect to obtaining direct assistance from internal auditors? And if so, what are they? Let's just go ahead and open it up to comments.
So I had one comment about governance in particular as I was looking over the standard and I was looking over academic research in this space. Certainly the standard covers some issues that direct auditors to pay attention to, like the level of expertise of internal audit and so forth. But one thing that was absent from the standard was consideration of governance. Specifically how much oversight the audit committee has over internal audit relative to management. The way the current standard is written, and I think even specifically paragraph 10, almost reads as if you presuppose that internal audit is reporting to management. And I think that that is an even bigger issue than looking at the capability of the internal audit or their expertise. Having the governance set up so that it is truly independent is the only way the external auditor should even be considering using that work in the first place. And then a second thought that I had, which is outside of the scope of your specific questions, but I think also important to consider, is that we've seen some great improvements in, providing more clarity to the investor about when we use some other auditor in the audit. And my question is, why is it different if you use the internal audit? It's been scoped out of that standard, and I don't really know why the investor shouldn't be entitled to the same type of transparency if there is significant participation by the internal auditor. And then thirdly, my comment is about when should you be using internal auditor, and I think it is particularly problematic if there is areas of high risk of restatement or high material risks. And secondly, if there's areas that are quite subjective, that can be problematic.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the early considerations of the use of internal auditors by the auditors, and it goes to Preeti's point a bit, is we know that intellectually the internal audit chief has a direct reporting relationship to the chairman of the audit committee, but inside the company, administratively, they report somewhere. And determining where and how they report administratively and how they are positioned, that is, how is the work of the internal auditor viewed by the senior team when it gets reported out, and then how does do the teams below the senior team therefore understand the positioning of internal audit? Tells you a lot about how it's considered, how it's taken. Does the internal auditor, does the chief audit executive or chief audit officer have a seat at the strategic table of the company beyond just the compliance functions? If you understand that positioning, and the reason I bring this up is because I think everyone around this table has been in places where internal audit functions had X positioning, which was not the best, and then you see Y positioning and you say, oh, now I understand. And I think the determination of where they sit and what the respect level is and the consideration level is and the type of work that they get involved with, not only from the compliance and controls perspective, but from the strategic perspective, is an important consideration in the auditors using the work of the internal auditor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Don White?
I'm sure I sound like a broken record on this, but let me emphasize what was just said. Certainly from a governance standpoint, those of us who advise on governance are telling companies that internal audit needs to report to the audit committee. Often the compromise of that is they report both internally and to the audit committee. But if you think about the kind of the key functions where you want the audit committee involved, you want them involved in compensation, you want them involved in performance reviews, and you certainly want them to have a role in the assignments of internal audit in terms of what it is they're looking at. But I mean, this is just kind of, I guess, good governance that we regularly advise on in this space. And I'm not just me, but all of us who advise in this space.
Thanks, John. Sarah?
I'll address some of the auditor perspective on the questions. And I think the biggest factor that auditors consider on whether to use internal audit is the internal audit structure of the entity. So depending on the sophistication of the company, depending on the industry that they work in, what the company has for internal audit is vastly different. And we have entities that are public companies that we audit that really don't have much of an internal audit function. Or what they do is focus more on compliance than more on financial reporting. So we really have to look at that and say, what is the skill set? What is the ability? And what is the capacity that they have? So like everyone else, I think right now in the whole ecosystem, there's strains on capacity. So sometimes internal audit doesn't have the excess capacity to do direct assistance or to enhance the services, what they're providing. They might be redirected into different areas. When we think about the risk assessment question, even though the standard doesn't explicitly require this, like I can speak to our methodology, does have a range of responses. So if it is a significant risk area, we would not be solely, having internal audit do direct work that we would rely on. And there's different reperformance metrics that we use for what we're looking at. So I think the firms are largely responding to this, starting with risk assessment and saying, okay, first of all, what is internal audit doing that's relevant to our work? Bringing that into the risk assessment to understanding if there, what internal audit might have found as findings that could be heightened risks for us. And then also as we go into using their work, really aligning that correctly to make sure that the auditor is doing the predominance of gathering evidence where it's most risky. And then I would just also say the kind of to the what are they using direct assistance for? And I'm going to sound like I kind of get teased like the national office, it depends answer, right? So it really comes back to what is internal audit doing and what do they have the skill set to do? So in some entities, they have a great skill set in internal control, then we might utilize them for some of the assistance with walkthroughs or something. But more often it tends to be, at least in my experience, some of the more tactical things. So, in our financial institutions, direct internal audit does a lot of work that can be tactical that we can help integrate into what we're doing. But in some of the operating type entities, they might not have as much work that really aligns with what the auditor is doing for financial reporting. So I think there's a breadth of things that we do, but it's definitely an area that can be incredibly accretive to our risk assessment when the entity has that skill set.
So I'm hearing it depends.
It depends, yes.
Oh, John.
Yeah, just one more thing that I forgot to mention. Where you find the shortfalls today in internal audit is very often in these companies, the de-SPAC companies, where they just don't have the same sophistication of being public companies. But that's the spot to really be on the lookout for internal audit governance shortfalls.
Brian.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good feedback here. This is a standard that I don't think is broken. I know that you're going through all of your standards, and certainly there are probably things that you could do to modernize and certainly put it, sort of redraft it in your way. But I wouldn't change too many things in trying to do that. I think the competence and objectivity considerations today, direct versus indirect, I think all that works really well. I'm not aware of significant performance issues in this space. Again, that doesn't mean there aren't things to do. And I would step back and look. I think over the years, there's been an evolution as to the incentives and pressures and the like relative to how one thinks about the use of internal audit and the extent of use. For instance, right after the time of 404, there was, I think, a lot of pressure and incentive to maximize the use of internal audit to reduce the costs of the audit, and we're not seeing that as much as we were then. And there's I think a number of reasons for that. One is I think firms have moved to the ability to have some degree of incremental offshore work performed at a different cost structure, technology, and meanwhile, importantly, I think internal audit groups in many cases have determined that the value proposition of doing other things than working in a direct assistance role with the auditor makes more sense for a larger portion of their work than perhaps historically. Some of that work, in fact, is focused on indirect NOCLAR, that goes beyond perhaps what the external auditor might be focused on. But I do think, having said all that, there's room to explore kind of how that's changed over time and make good use of the work of internal audit from a risk assessment perspective, thinking about what they may know, and back to our earlier discussion on fraud. Internal audit is a great group to be talking to relative to their views and perspectives on fraud within the potential risks of fraud within the organization, and making sure that that's informing your risk assessment. I guess I would also say that in normal course in using internal audit, like we're doing in other aspects of the audit, if you are using them in direct assistance, beginning to think about are they using technology or AI or doing things differently than they were in the past, so that that's being contemplated in your work. So as you think about updates to standards, that's another place where AI and considerations around it and technology might be interesting to think about, and making sure the risks around that are being considered as well. So those are just a few of my thoughts. But again, I think a standard that's not in need of significant change conceptually.
Thank you, Brian. Christine? I agree with what Sarah and Brian said, so I don't want to be redundant there. I will say, in addition to the factors that were articulated about when to consider using the work of internal audit, we definitely look at if there's a systematic and disciplined approach that internal audit is using, and that could be one area where the standard could be enhanced to make that clear. I also agree. I think, Sarah, you said, we generally don't use the work of internal audit in areas of significant risk. So that's just not an issue given what practice is to me in that area. And then about direct assistance, I do think that's also limited in practice when you're trying to get direct assistance from the internal auditor. When you do that, it is to get an understanding of the internal controls and the walkthrough. But I think it's generally not considered to be an effective or efficient approach, because the level of direction, supervision, and review you would have to do would make it, not as efficient or as effective of an approach.
May I just, and I agree with all that, may I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
I just, on the significant risk point, and I didn't raise it, I agree with Christine, we think about it the same way. If you're thinking about the standard in that space, one thing just to keep in mind though is in this, I suspect Christine may agree with me here, but there may be things internal audit could do in an area that relates to a significant risk, but is not the subject of the significant risk, right? So I just think you got to be careful not to just assume because it's an area of significant risk, there's nothing that could be done by internal audit. I know that's not what you said, but some might understand that can come up sometimes in in certain contexts. So I would just keep that in mind. Yeah.
Thanks for that follow-up, Brian. Christian?
The only thing that I didn't hear, but I'm sure that my firm colleagues will agree, or at least I didn't hear it as directly perhaps as might need to be mentioned. Not only do we focus on the competency and the objectivity, and we direct those activities towards really low risk areas, but part of the evaluation is to go and reperform some of what they've done. So we independently go and look and make sure that what they're doing would work for us, not just for their own standards. So we do reperform a lot of the work that internal audit does. So I thought that I'd make that point in addition to the points that everyone's made. One of the things that Brian said, though, that I'll just reemphasize is while I don't have empirical data about this, I could probably go get it. I think that the use of internal audit is going down, and probably if I were to prognosticate, I would guess that it's going to continue to go down as technology really starts to replace a lot of the low-level work. So, I guess I also would have invested in companies like Blockbuster. So I guess you can take that for what it's worth.
Yes.
Thank you. Just wanted to emphasize the point that the professor made and John White made with respect to paragraph 10 and the organizational status of the internal audit reports too. So Professor Chowdhury suggested there's some empirical evidence indicating that it'd be better if it's reported to the audit committee rather than an officer. John White suggested best practice is that. So at least one paragraph, I think, needs to be adjusted, and that's paragraph 10, where, as the professor suggested, that paragraph to me implies that the internal auditor is reporting to an officer or someone at the company. So at least that paragraph, I think, needs to be looked at carefully.
Preeti?
It's great to hear if the trend is going down of using internal audit, but one thing just to keep in mind as we are seeing a shortage of accountants available in the market is there may actually be an increased need to use internal audit simply because of shortages in the auditor's staff. And so this could be a risk to be aware of on the horizon, depending on how things continue.
Thank you, Preeti. John?
Just to emphasize what Jeff and John and Sarah said, and to suggest one thing, if you want a model for the minimum governance standards, the 40 Act Chief Compliance Officer requirements of independence, where the CCO's for 40 Act funds effectively serve a similar, although not exact purpose, might be a way to save some drafting.
It may be too detailed, but remember executive sessions with the internal audit as well.
Two more questions. Okay. Slides.
Slide.
Okay. And our last two questions are mostly about the environment. And they are, the fifth one is, have advancements in technology affected the use of internal audit by the auditor? If so, how? Are there other environmental factors that have affected the use of internal audit by the auditor? If so, what are they? And then the last one is, are there other factors or aspects of the use of internal auditors by the auditor that should be evaluated when considering changes to the auditing standard? For example, how do stakeholders view the auditor's use of internal audit?
Jennifer?
Yeah, so with respect to other stakeholders, I know that there's academic research that shows that auditors are reluctant to use internal auditors when they think there is an enhanced risk, legal exposure on the audit, because they think that the everyday investor and user is not effectively understanding the use of internal audits on low risk areas. And so in those circumstances where they feel that the risk level is escalated, that the external auditor will not rely on the internal audit group, and instead they will perform the work on their own.
Thank you.
Going once.
Well, I got
John White.
I'm not sure where it fits in, but just one other thought that I've encountered on several occasions where the audit committee has actually engaged, in this case, one of the big four firms, to come in on a consulting basis and review the internal audit function. And I don't know if all the firms have that available service, but it is, you get a very impressive report looking at the internal audit function and on 20 different parameters and making suggestions of where it is coming up short. And I've certainly seen at least two cases where the audit committee was very happy to get that help in making sure that they had kind of a class internal audit function.
Thank you. I think that looks like we've gotten everyone's views. So thank you for that. Thank you for the great discussion and for contributions throughout the day. I also want to again thank the Emerging Issues and Auditing Subcommittee for all the work they put in and in our fraud discussion. I do, before we close, want to take a moment to thank some of my colleagues who work very hard behind the scenes to make these meetings possible. From the Office of the Chief Auditor, I'd like to thank Jessica Watts and Danny Burbeck and Akiko Upchurch, along with our presenters and the Office of External Affairs, especially Wilda Santiago, Brian Goodna, and Todd Cranford. I hope you all have a wonderful summer. I do hope to be in touch with you in the next weeks and months, just as a check-in. And that now concludes our meeting, and we look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.
On track.
To your friend.
Plan
To your point about where
Yeah.
Yes.